This is Josh Friedman in Kiev, Ukraine, at the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital, which was struck this morning amid a Russian missile barrage fired all over Ukraine, with hits in numerous locations, including in the capital, Kiev. The strikes today on Kiev seem to be the most significant ones on the Ukrainian capital in months, with this strike here at the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital getting the most attention. There are casualties. It's unclear at the moment how many people were killed and injured as a result of a missile striking this hospital.
This is Dan Dicks here reporting for Press for Truth, and the footage that you just watched is of a missile hitting a children's hospital in Ukraine. And this just happened yesterday, which is on the eve of a NATO summit, which kicks off today in Washington, D.C. And President Joe Biden has already condemned this as being Russian brutality. As we see here from BBC, Biden condemns Russian brutality after deadly Ukraine strikes. U.S. President Joe Biden has condemned a wave of Russian missile strikes that killed at least 38 people in Ukraine as a horrific reminder of Russia's brutality, as he vowed to strengthen Kiev's air defenses. At least 190 were injured across the country, including some at Ukraine's biggest children's hospital in the capital, Kiev, on Monday. Ukraine published photos on Tuesday of what it said were recovered fragments of a Russian cruise missile that hit the Okhmatdyt hospital. Russia claimed that the blast was caused by a misfiring Ukrainian air defense missile, but the UN said it was highly likely that Moscow was behind the attack. Now, obviously, when there are escalations in a war to this extent, one must always ask the question, qui bono, or who benefits? And we're certainly going to take a look at that today. Joining me on the line right now to discuss this and much more is my friend and reporter Josh Friedman, who is there, boots on the ground, reporting from Ukraine, who was just there and went through all this. So Josh, thank you so much for taking some time today to report on this from the scene. Now, there's a lot to be said about what's happening with this NATO summit, and whether this missile was from the Russians or the Ukrainians, and we could talk about that stuff. But before we do, maybe you could start us off with what this experience has been like you for a journalist. I mean, I can't imagine what it's been like hearing the explosions going off all around you and then running out with your camera and covering this. So maybe you could start with that. What has this experience been like? How did this all start for you?
Sure, Dan. Thank you for having me. So it was Monday morning, yesterday morning. I woke up to the sound of numerous explosions. It's hard for me to say exactly how many, but at the time I remember thinking, okay, maybe I heard 20, 30, 40 different explosions. And to my, let's say, untrained ear, they sounded mostly like intercepts. I've been Ukraine a few times during the war, and I've been other hot war zones, and it sounded to me like I was mostly hearing Ukrainian air defense intercepting incoming missile fire. And I guess to some extent that was true, but clearly there was impact in multiple locations, with the Okhmatdyt Children's Hospital being the most significant one. And sort of as you described it, I rushed over there. I didn't get over there immediately. It wasn't too far away, but I made it over there. And yeah, it was a very disturbing scene to take in. There, I was breathing in not so pleasant air, let's call it. And it was just, I didn't see any bodies. I saw a couple people injured. I'm not wounded. I'm not entirely sure if it was from that impact or what, but I mostly saw a large effort to clean up the debris and first responders there. And there were people hosing down this one building where there clearly was major damage, if not being the actual impact point. And I stayed at the scene for hours and took it all in, filmed as much as I could. And yeah, it's a tough it's something tough to take in. That it is a very large children's hospital complex, the biggest and most reputable children's hospital in Ukraine. Some people say one of the most reputable children's hospitals in all of Europe. And that is not a pleasant sight to be at a children's hospital that has been, or at least the complex has been struck by a missile, and you know there are casualties, and seeing all the debris cleanup, it's just, it's a difficult sight to take in.
Yeah, well, from what I understand, there was a lot of young cancer patients that had to be set up outside on the sidewalk, essentially, dealing. They had to do what they could do with these with these children in there, and it's just horrific. Now, obviously, with such a terrible tragedy, the finger of blame is being pointed from both sides at each other. The Kremlin is vehemently denying that they did this, and of course the Ukraine is saying this wasn't an air defense missile. But you've been on the grounds. You've been speaking with some people. You've done some interviews. You've talked with people. What's kind of the vibe you're getting from from on the grounds? Because the mainstream media is just full blown saying, "Yep, Russia did it, hands down, no question." But what's the vibe that you're getting there in Ukraine on what actually happened here?
Well, overwhelmingly, people in Ukraine fault Russia, and I, it's almost a given that's going to be the case. I'm not a ballistics expert. I'm not a military official or a military analyst. From what I've reviewed and the people I've spoken with, and I did an interview with a Ukrainian National Guard captain. His name is Nick Demiduk. He's actually a longtime friend of mine. He broke it down yesterday for me while I was still at the scene, and since then more has come out. I would lean toward this indeed being a KH-101 Russian cruise missile that struck the Children's Hospital complex for a few different reasons. One being, if you free, there were kind of surprisingly good in terms of quality, good quality clips of the missile striking the complex. If you look at the freeze frame, and you compare to images of a KH-101, it does look quite similar to me. The missile was intact, which is not very common to see an intact missile striking a building like that, intact as opposed to debris falling. So you can kind of rule out that an intercept occurred and that debris scattered all over the place, and that was the result of, and the Children's Hospital strike was the result of debris fall, and you can kind of rule that out. So for a few different reasons, I would lean to it being, in this case, what you might refer to as the official story, a KH-101 Russian cruise missile. But again, I'm no military expert. I'm no ballistics expert. I'm more of a boots on the ground reporter, as you would say. I did, as almost as soon as the incident happened, I checked what the Russian government was saying, and yes, they were saying that it was Ukrainian air defense that misfired. I'm a bit skeptical of what the Kremlin's putting out about this, but I'm not the one to give you a definitive answer about what indeed struck the Children's Hospital complex and why.
Sure. Yeah, we don't want to speculate too much on that when it's still, the smoke is still smoldering. But today in Washington D.C., they're discussing the future of NATO, and I would imagine that this hospital strike is going to potentially shift the conversation in some sort of way in the next coming days at the summit. How do you think the discussion might change in light of these recent events?
Well, it's certainly getting headlines. It's certainly getting press attention. You might argue that this is favorable for Ukraine, that it's obviously a horrific tragedy. So there's nothing good about a children's hospital getting struck and there being casualties. But in terms of public perception, you could argue that this this may be favorable to Ukraine. Maybe it helps Ukraine somewhat in what Zelensky and the Ukrainian officials be asking for at the NATO summit. I personally don't think this is gonna change a whole lot. That's just my hunch. This is a horrific war, and this is hardly the first time that a hospital was struck. There have been hospitals struck in this war previously, sometimes getting a whole lot of attention, sometimes not. In fact, I believe there's another hospital that was struck elsewhere in Kiev yesterday. But regarding this attack, it was significantly different and a bit surprising to Ukrainians here, in that they'd somewhat gotten used to every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, there being a missile barrage, but this was far and away the most intense one in a while. Definitely the most intense one since I've been here, and caused the most impact within Kiev in months, if not longer. And on top of that, it occurred during daytime hours. So it was on a Monday morning, and often there are missile strikes or missile barrages on Monday morning, but this was well after the sun had risen, and that has not been Russia's MO recently in terms of missile barrages. So why exactly Russia launched this barrage and did so at the timing? Sorry about the motorcycles zooming by. I'm in the center of Kiev. The curfew is fast approaching. Why exactly Russia launched this barrage in the way they did, I don't know. I do think that Ukrainian officials will diplomatically try to get as much as they can out of it, but I wouldn't expect that, for instance, this is going to get them an open invitation into joining NATO. I'm not going to expect that. Maybe they can end up procuring or receiving more air defense as they so desperately need. Maybe this airstrike and missile barrage, and particularly what happened at the Children's Hospital, is going to sway some people within the NATO summit into forking over or supplying more air defense for Ukraine. I guess that's a realistic possibility, but in terms of something that changes the entire war or clear pathway to Ukrainian NATO membership, I just don't see that coming right now and at this summit.
Right. Well, I mean, as we, started in the discussion here, a big question is key bono, and I guess it really comes down to, was this intentionally done by the Russians, which has major implications, or was this something done in defense and which happened by mistake, which is also going to have major implications of its own. So when you look at both possibilities and you sit back and kind of take a step back, maybe we could go into that just to kind of in closing a little bit, is who does it seem like would benefit the most from something like this happening, whether it be a targeted attack on purpose or whether it be an accident from either side? Who do you think stands to gain the most?
Well, there are multiple possibilities in terms of an accident. There are targets all over Kiev, and there were other targets hit, although one might question if these missiles tend to have the accuracy that they're known to have, and there were successful targeted strikes. Why is a missile that's aimed for some energy or infrastructure target or military target pretty far away or some distance away impacting directly a children's hospital complex? So I know here it's pretty widely viewed or believed that Russia would intentionally do this. It's not for me to say whether or not Russia would intentionally do this. I don't really see who has a whole lot to gain from this altogether, because like I said, maybe Ukraine gets more air defense out of this. I highly doubt the Ukrainians would intentionally fire a Patriot missile or whatever air defense missile directly into a children's hospital complex. That it just doesn't really make sense to me. But I personally don't think anyone stands to benefit a whole lot from this, given the realities of the war, the situation on the ground here, the geopolitical realities surrounding NATO and NATO expansion. So it's hard for me to say. I would lean toward this being an actual Russian missile that hit the children's hospital complex, deliberate. I don't know. Like I said, I interviewed my friend who's a captain in the Ukrainian National Guard. He said he views it as highly likely that it was intentional. You're probably going to hear that a lot when asking Ukrainians. It's not really for me to say, nor do I feel comfortable with coming to that conclusion.
Well, I appreciate, your coverage of this, having the courage to just go there, rush down there with your camera, document this and ask those important questions, that a lot of the mainstream media isn't really asking. They're just jumping on one side of this thing. So I'm glad to see you there asking all these important questions. So if anybody wants to follow your work, Josh, where would you say is the best place to go? I know you're posting a lot of this to X, formerly Twitter. Where would you say is the best place for people to go if they want to view your coverage of this?
On X or Twitter, you can find me at Freeman Reporter. That's spelled as it sounds, at Freeman Reporter, and I'm Josh Friedman on YouTube.
Perfect. I'm going to put both of those links in the description below. I'd strongly encourage everyone to check it out. We have to support journalists who are willing to do the boots on the grounds reports and to cut through the biases and the mainstream narrative of things to get to the bottom of what's really happening. So we appreciate your efforts to do that, Josh. Make sure everybody you check those links in the description below, and we'll talk to you next time, Josh. Once again, thank you so much. You keep up the great work out there in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you for taking interest in this.
We all want truth. The truth will set you free.